Welcome to the Euterpean Podcast. This is Zachary Davies. For this episode, I had the very special honour of talking with Darius Brubeck. We start by exploring Darius's musical origins in the Brubeck household, discussing the kinds of things he would listen to and play growing up, as well as the wide-reaching influence from his family. This naturally takes us to his perception of music, and specifically jazz, where we talk about his approach to improvisation. We take, as an example, his piece Earthrise, which was inspired by the popular 1970s photo by NASA showing the Earth rising above the lunar horizon. Nevertheless, Darius told me whether it be a narrative or the use of jazz vocabulary, for him, improvisation is always subsumed in playing the changes. We also talk about his time in South Africa, where he introduced the first jazz studies course into an African university, and how it became not only a beacon for jazz and jazz education, but also for liberal values in an apartheid country. Darius told me after our conversation that he felt he didn't emphasize enough how, in this South African musical community, music goes far beyond entertainment or messaging, although that's part of its role. It goes straight to the heart, so that's the way the players play it too. As I say in this episode, it would feel strange to host a public conversation right now without mentioning the current atrocities in Ukraine. I draw a comparison to the Cold War and its relatively little-known use of cultural exchange as a means of de-escalation. And this is a topic that's very important to Darius, because in 1958 he went along with his father's quartet behind the Iron Curtain as far as Poland, where he witnessed the harsh reality of communism, but also the ability of jazz to bring people together. Needless to say, Darius and the Brubeck family have strong, current and ancestral ties to the people in Eastern Europe. Indeed, we discuss Dave Brubeck's 1958 concert in Poland and how, when the Darius Brubeck Quartet performed there 60 years later, producing the album Live in Poland, which was listed by Downbeat as one of the best albums of 2020, many people who were at Dave's concert came and expressed just how important it was to them. I hope you enjoy. If you would like to support this podcast, perhaps you would consider becoming a patron on Patreon. A link can be found in the description. For more information about this episode or the podcast in general, find me on Instagram or Twitter at ZDavisMusic. Thank you. Darius Brubeck, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Zachary.
I'd like to start by exploring your musical origins, if I may. That's usually how I like to start these things, just to give some context. So I imagine when growing up that your household must have been really full of music. I mean, your father being a revolutionary jazz musician, and your mother was a talented lyricist, and you, and as we were just talking about, many of your siblings have become fine professional musicians in your own right. So what was it like growing up, musically speaking, in the Brubeck home?
Well, one word would be eclectic, and another, as you suggest, would be immersive. I'm the eldest of originally five brothers and a sister. One of my brothers died some time ago. And my father's mother, our grandmother, who sometimes came and looked after us, was a very good classical pianist. She didn't have a career as a concert pianist, but one wonders how far she might have gone. She studied with Dame Myra Hess and Tobias Mattei, which is very unusual for a Californian woman in the pre-World War II era. She was that good. She had some credentials and taught piano in the little cow towns that the family, our grandfather on my father's side was a cattle rancher. And my father said that, when he growing up, he and his two elder brothers, like my uncles, just spent all of their time being cattlemen, just like in a Western movie, except due to their mother's influence, Henry and Howard both became professional musicians. And Dave, being the youngest, then was supposed to take over the herd and the ranch. And his father was very disappointed when that didn't happen, that they all became musicians. But growing up, from our point of view, playing music was self-evidently what grown-ups did. You grew up, you had two uncles and a grandmother and a father, who played music, plus Dad's friends who were Paul Desmond and people like that. When they came to the house, they would come to the piano and they would take out sheets of music and they would play music and say, oh, well, that's what life is. It didn't take long to get another perspective, but it was that immersive. The question that obviously follows would be, what did we listen to? And that's where immersive moves to eclectic. I want to, kind of rewind, give a little bit more background.
Sure.
Being the eldest, I can remember quite a few years before Dave Brubeck was Dave Brubeck, before he had a national or international following or any hits. So he was, I will deliberately change pianist to piano player. He was making a living on a very precarious basis, playing gigs and clubs when he could get them. And so we didn't start off with wonderful houses that he was famous for. He was like a real architecture buff too. But in the small apartments that we lived in Oakland and San Francisco, we had a record player, and the records that I remember, the first classical records I remember, because I think that's a particular interest of yours, right?
Sure. Yes. Classical, jazz music, all of it, really.
Yeah. Well, he was very strongly into, at the time, the Bartók string quartets, played them a lot. So, and I think he also wanted us to develop as, having a 20th century ear. So we didn't really start with the obvious, kind of Handel and Haydn and Mozart, but, which we love. But I'm saying our starting point was contemporary or nearly contemporary. And Copland, as kids, we used to, what we really, really liked, to play on the record player over and over again was Copland, El Salón Mexico.
Right.
And Firebird, Petrushka.
Stravinsky, yeah.
So we wanted just to have all those sounds in our heads before we even began to think about playing instruments.
Oh, so this was before, or maybe at the same time as you were learning the piano, and
a long time before.
A long time before. Did your grandmother teach you at all, or did you have a different teacher?
I had different teachers at different times. I was pretty dilatory about it. No, Grandma Bessie wasn't around that much enough to really teach us, except, there is teaching by example. And, so she was very classical. She played Chopin etudes and, kind of the popular hits of the early
the classical world, yeah,
classical world. And I did have piano lessons off and on once I got to be, school age and so on. Dave, as we do refer to him as Dave, was away so much. He wasn't going to teach us. He was going to occasionally come home and tell us what we were doing wrong and show us some tricks. But there was no kind of idea of sequentially learning something. But, if I played something and it would be something it would just be something I learned to play for my own reasons or just by chance. He might make a comment like, okay, well, can you play that in a different key? Can you play that in every key?
Right.
You know,
Hard.
just keep raising the bar and then go off for another 2 weeks on the road with his quartet. You know.
Sure. And so my impression there is that really jazz and 20th century classical music were hand in hand when you were growing up, at least in your immersion of them. And do you think that's impacted the way you play piano, the way you think about jazz music or music in general?
Yeah, I think so. It encouraged curiosity in technical terms, very high tolerance for dissonance. In fact, the word dissonance almost doesn't make sense to me. I mean, if you know what I mean. I mean, but
it has been emancipated. It has been, yeah.
But on the other hand, as you heard, I play in a very mainstream way. Jazz and classical music are really based on, for the most part, on a harmonic system that still functions. Before harmony started coming back into concert music, kind of in the 80s, you might have said that jazz was the life form that continued to explore harmony. Diatonic, very chromatic and very modal and all of that, but harmony as a structuring principle was kept alive and continued to develop in jazz when it was pretty out of fashion in the world remade by Stockhausen, for example.
I think Barry Harris would probably agree with you on that. I know I've seen many YouTube videos of him giving lessons. I was talking to John Salmon about this actually when we were talking about improvisation, and he said he feels like a classical musician because in many ways, harmonically speaking, rhythm is another thing altogether. But at least with the harmony, he felt that really, he improvised over some Chopin changes, right? So he felt a certain affinity for classical music. Although he has some rather extreme controversial opinions, like the only reason you should learn a piece of classical music is to learn how to compose and how to improvise, because you're learning the decision process that composer made, and so you can absorb it in that way. So I guess this naturally leads on then to how you improvise, because we've spoken a bit about your musical language. And I think when I heard you at Ronnie Scott's, that there were also all kinds of things though that I enjoyed. I mean, you're using the full scope of the sounds of the piano. I think the first track was Earthrise, I think. And this sort of massive sound with the pedal. And then, so I quite like that because it's not that usual, I don't think. I mean, there's something quite unusual about it. So when improvising, and I'd like to go into your own approach of improvising and harmony, because I've seen that you've made several courses on it, and of course you've taught it as well in South Africa. How you conceive it. So you've spoken essentially that it's harmonic. Do you ever think motivically? Or, I, as a classical musician who loves jazz, I'm always trying to get into the minds of jazz musicians to see if I can ever do it.
Sure you can. I'm sort of going through several filtering processes, thinking how technical to be, but there's something very simple that I do, which is, as far as I'm concerned, with some kind of harmonic framework. I think the opening sentence, or at least the opening chapter of Schoenberg's theory of harmony, says something to the effect that harmony is a structuring device or principle of structure. So that's always going to be there in my music. And I think the difference between jazz and classical improvisation, because there is an improvisatory tradition in classical music too, is perhaps less than many people think it is. The main difference is language. It isn't a question of how music works. I think a lot of classical musicians, in a way, overestimate what we do as jazz musicians. It's we what we do is come from a place where the vocabulary is different, but the underlying theory isn't very different. When I play over a set of chord changes, it's going to sound different because my vocabulary is different. My musical language has other precedents. So that's why if you were to do a figured bass analysis of a Chopin piece, you would play something else on it, and it might not sound like jazz to you or someone else. But it doesn't mean that what you are doing isn't valid musically, right? So if I were giving a lecture on the subject, I wouldn't necessarily emphasize my approach, but my approach is narrative. And to me, that's more important than anything else because my preferred context. And I know that the structuring principle of harmony is going to hold the form together and get me back to where I started or to where the next person takes over and also improvises. There are other ways, really good ways that look, more abstractly at musical possibilities, kind of art for art's sake. How can we push the boundaries? How can we explore different possibilities or bring more language into it or whatever? But like the piece that you called, that you referred to, that's Earthrise. It's the first track on the Darius Brubeck quartet, live in Poland. Actually, all of my originals are kind of storytelling. That's used in the broadest sense. There isn't really a narrative in the sense that an opera has a narrative, but it takes into account, it's inspired by or an attempt to render some kind of conscious conception of imagery, of tension, of going somewhere. In the case of Earthrise, the big glissando is just an obvious liftoff.
Sure, yeah. Gesture.
Yeah, gesture. So I like to surround myself, as I have done, with really good musicians who are, for the most part, in charge of getting all the jazz right. But I'm kind of composing. Even if it's improvisation, it's kind of instant composing.
Right,
and I think the piano has a great power to add texture or to thin it out or to steer things in a certain direction, whether it's through harmonic manipulation, dynamics, density. I work with all these things. And Dave O'Higgins, the tenor player that you heard, he's a real master of the jazz language in a more specific and I think more evolved sense. I think if you're looking purely in terms of jazz content, his solos are doing something else. We work well together, I think, because we work differently. We're not both trying to do the same thing. We sometimes talk to each other musically, like if he plays a line that I like at a certain point in the progression, if he's played first and I played second, I'll kind of say, yeah, I heard that, and do the same line or do the same line a minor third above or something like that. These are kind of musician jokes that keep the group bonded and swinging and having fun together. But mainly I'm kind of aiming for the story. It's still Bartok 6 or Firebird or something that's going on, that's going somewhere, that has a beginning, middle, and end.
You mentioned the kind of contrast there, or just difference between you and Dave O'Higgins. And I think that's quite an effective way, I think, of generating good jazz. I mean, you can look at either, the Paul Desmond and Dave Brubeck. I think they also had very different approaches to improvisation and the sounds that they got, but also Miles Davis and John Coltrane in the same quintet. Miles Davis is a very different kind of improviser, and yet they do bounce off of each other, I think, in a nice narrative or rhetorical way. And I think it just adds color to the sound world somehow. I think if every single player is playing bebop licks, maybe there's a certain homogeneity about it. I don't know. Although I'm not a jazz musician, I'm just a listener.
No, but I think that's very, very true. But there are all these different, all valid, all things that can maybe cease to be valid when they're overdone. All contributing things to music. I wouldn't want to become too literal in what I call my narrative or storytelling approach, because that could be just corny. But, on the other hand, people who've really got the bebop thing down, no matter how good it is, you get to a point where you feel the musicians are just talking to each other. And the fun of it for me as a professional musician is the competition and the wit and the one-upmanship or the reference or, here's a bit of Wayne Shorter. How do you take that? Oh, well, here's Bergonzi. Take that. But are you giving people what they need in terms of, kind of reaching out to an audience? And, I don't mean just playing music to amuse people, but I mean, kind of bonding with an audience and getting a feeling going together. So, I'm not disparaging people with a lot of chops. That would sound like envy. And sometimes it is, but music can be about much more than that. And all the great artists that you mentioned always knew that.
Well, that relates a little bit to what you said earlier about, certain approaches. One is art for art's sake. And I suppose if you're too detached from the listener in a way, then you're more in that camp, I suppose. Yeah. You also mentioned vocabulary. Do you think the best way to learn this vocabulary is by listening, or maybe by transcribing yourself at the piano or at your instrument? Or do you think, is there even another way of learning this vocab?
Well, no, the best way is listening and imitation, not just in a metaphorical sense, in quite a direct, concrete sense. It's language acquisition.
Right.
That accounts for a lot of it. Most people nowadays, and I'm going to sort of place myself in a different generation, believe that transcription is really the way, that it's an amazing tool because it makes you, visually represent really difficult rhythms and so forth.
Sure.
But I won't say that it's my way because I'm no good at it. I can imitate music, which is sort of good ear training or, good technical training. But, I haven't got the kind of transcription chops that you really need to take down a jazz solo. And I imagine that really is literally consciousness altering, if you can do that. And there are people who do, but not me. My basic building blocks toward acquiring vocabulary are all just oral, just things that move me, that I like to use. And I get them from any kind of music I happen to listen to. I've studied Indian music quite extensively and listen to it a lot to this day, which is, again, I don't take it to the extreme of like someone who literally uses it, unless I'm collaborating with Indian musicians. Now, I've done that. But if it's a jazz gig, if I'm playing at Ronnie Scott's and I'm not playing with Indian musicians, I won't say, let's do a raga, because it would be inauthentic and, kind of dishonest. But it influences my aesthetic. Again, Indian music has, a very strong tradition of development, which it just occurs to me, and to use a term you brought into the conversation, it is motivic in a certain way. That's certainly an influence on my improvisational vocabulary.
Sure. Well, we're sort of in the land of jazz pedagogy now, so I'd like to ask you about your time in South Africa, because I read that you introduced the first jazz studies course to an African university. So what brought you to South Africa? That
was really kind of the longest phase of my career, from 1983 to 2005. My wife is South African, and we're just in the process of completing a book about our time there, about our, and I say ours because even though she's not a musician, she is very good organizer and very familiar with how the music world works, which is so important. Very good manager, very good concert organizer, and that sort of thing. The thing to understand is there was no formal jazz education in South Africa, but there was a very productive jazz scene. And so at that time, what we were doing was fighting apartheid by creating a kind of cultural transformation within an institution that had prestige. It had a music department. It was training classical pianists and opera singers. And it had a very visionary head of department who has published extensively on South African jazz. And he wanted to set up a jazz course. And he asked if I would apply if he succeeded in getting permission to do that. And I did, thinking, well, that would be a gesture of support. At the time he was speaking to me, I had no idea I'd have an academic career. I was playing around New York and New England. I had some fairly light but plausible academic credentials. I had done ethnomusicology and history of religion at Wesleyan University, and I'd done some part-time teaching in some institutions in Connecticut who, wanted some, understanding jazz kind of modules. But the main thing was that if we could bring musicians who were already active into the university and offer them that kind of support, which to a large extent was physical, a place where there is a piano, a drum kit, a couple of amps, a place to, rehearse and work. And the possibility of acquiring music literacy, which was a problem for many of them. Not that they didn't have it at all, but there was no one, they didn't have coaching, teaching, any kind of formal route to follow. And in so doing, our agenda really was to change the culture of the institution. And we did. We created a world famous center within the university called the Center for Jazz and Popular Music at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. And that is both an administrative entity that was very public facing and a venue. It's a physical place. It's actually a place with a bar, tables and chairs, a stage, a good sound system, and a baby grand piano. And we started off, obviously I played there lots, but, students performing there, beginning to draw in crowds. And eventually, because our infrastructure was good, we've had like really good international artists there over the years, because it became one of the better places to play for both an understanding audience and the vibe and the correct infrastructure. But it took a long time. It wasn't like I was handed the keys to a theater or a club and told, okay, start teaching there. I mean, we literally had to go step by step and acquire every piece of equipment and remodeling parts of the building and all of that. Meanwhile, being mainly preoccupied with student welfare, because we're talking, especially in the 80s and 90s, about students who were literally so poor they just didn't have any money, and we would sort of fabricate different scenarios where they would get these kind of fictitious loans that would never be paid back, or go around collecting money from, like local businesses, and getting help from people who were also very oriented toward the anti-apartheid movement, supporting these students. And mainly we started getting a lot of gigs for them. And we did, I'm going we. I'm not speaking French, and I'm not being royal. I just want to emphasize that my wife, Catherine, was so much a part of this, because I really had a very serious day gig. Anyone who starts a jazz program in a university anywhere, it could be in the US, it doesn't have to be, somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere, will say that the jazz guy, as we're always known, unlike anyone else on a music faculty, the jazz guy has to do theory, history, practical teaching on his instrument, coordinate practical lessons on other instruments. He's responsible for the progress of all of those students, and in the case of South Africa, responsible directly for their welfare, their maintenance, as in where they live and how they eat, getting them gigs. So, this was really a two-person job from the beginning, and I had the formal title, but Kathy really did a lot. On the pedagogy side, there was, I was so lucky. Well, not lucky, but the situation was just perfect, because there was an uptake of musicians who were active in the field. They understood what they needed to learn, they wanted to learn, and they were very creative in their own right. So the success was, I'm not being unduly modest. It was a lot of work, but we always knew that it was going to work, because the student musicians were so good.
It's brilliant that it became such a success, and congratulations. I suppose also, obviously, the societal challenges are awful in that regard, but musically speaking, could have been was a golden opportunity to rethink ideas of pedagogy. And I suppose this is referring now to the course you've made online. I mentioned earlier about harmony and how to teach that, because you also mentioned musical literacy. And so what made that approach different? Because I suppose you wanted, as you had so many responsibilities, you needed to make sure that the musical literacy was there, the piano playing on musical instrument playing ability was there, and eventually gigs. So I suppose it had to be efficient and musical and all of those things at once.
Yeah, I think what you're saying almost describes a mindset of having a really good method like Barry Harris. And
right.
Actually, I didn't. I had a philosophy, but not a method. There's quite a difference there. I was improvising the whole time. I mean, that was my first and only full-time job ever. So my philosophy, as opposed to having a real method, was let's facing students. Well, what can you do? Not what can't you do, or what you have to learn. What can you do? How do we get from there to where you want to be? And trying to build up, people that I found, were very motivated and everything anyway, but everyone needs upskilling. I could start taking lessons today and be challenged, very challenged. So the whole thing was working with students as individuals. And the other thing that is constantly in flux, constantly being debated. Well, okay, you're bringing jazz. You've got jazz musicians in South Africa. They're there because they like the music, but isn't it really? Aren't you imposing, or at least importing, a foreign culture? Just as could be said about the students who are learning to sing Mozart and Verdi. Why even do that? It's a legitimate question. And again, my starting point was that I wanted them to learn the canon. They were already pretty much familiar with it anyway. But I really tried very hard to, instead of ignoring what they could already do, tried to build on it. Again, it comes back to that. And South African jazz is a particular flavor, just as jazz from the Scandinavian countries and from Brazil. It's a particular style. So it would be presumptuous to teach people to do what they're already doing. I certainly didn't want to be that kind of Yankee, but I didn't want to impose, everything being straight ahead, everything based on a clean, precise American approach too. I mean, it was something to aspire to if you did aspire to it, but I didn't penalize people who were just interested in something else. On the contrary, I tried to encourage that.
Yeah, I think that's a challenging sociological question, I suppose. And I think my answer would be, I suppose it's all in the intention. And I think provided it's well-intentioned and well-respecting the South African culture, like you say, there's a Swedish jazz scene, as there is now a South African jazz scene, a British jazz scene. And they are, as you say, different flavors, and the culture already there is just can only add. It's it can only enhance. It's nothing can be taken away, I suppose, provided it's not a dogmatic approach to teaching. And I suppose jazz tends to bring people together. And I do have a slightly maybe less positive segue, but it would feel strange to have a public conversation like this without mentioning what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. And the question I was thinking, what could I ask? And I know that, say, back in the 1950s, you accompanied the Darius Brubeck Quartet all the way to as far as Poland, I think, on the State Department tour. And of course, there are controversies around that, and Dave knew that, and that's why the Real Ambassadors was composed, right? Exactly. It's sort of a commentary on the there's criticism on the negative parts. But I think that there are also some positive things to be said in it's positive intention. So, given your firsthand experience of how music and specifically jazz can bring people together, either in a society which is really quite oppressive, and that could be in South Africa, but also when you saw in Poland. Is there really? Do you think at all, as there was in the Cold War, and several people, many listeners may not know this, but there was room for cultural exchange as a means of de-escalation, military de-escalation, just to remind people that we're all just human, we're all just here, and why don't we just reflect on that, and that can help us make decisions. Is this something that's come to mind in recent weeks?
Very much so. Well, yesterday, in fact, my brother Chris and I exchanged emails because he's worked extensively in Russia in collaboration with the Russian National Orchestra and with other entities. And I was in Russia in 2019. It's amazing what COVID does to kind of obliterate timelines sometimes. And the year after I was in Poland, which is 2018. And there are so many overlapping stories. But my first time in Poland was in 1958, as you said in your introduction. And as a child from California, the Cold War to me was literally a Cold War. I have never been so cold in my life, indoors, outdoors. The welcome that my parents and the quartet received was just wonderful. And that was due to Willis Conover's Voice of America broadcasts. It was illegal to even listen to them. But that was how jazz was getting behind the Iron Curtain, Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America. When I came back in 2018, there were still obviously very old people who had been to their concerts, or grandchildren who were taking their very aged relatives, to come and see me again, introduce themselves. And it was kind of a victory lap.
Right.
For throwing off communism. It coincided with the 100th anniversary of Poland, in effect, being the Poles reckon their nationhood from the end of World War II. So from 1918 to 2018, these overlapping anniversaries, and the 60th anniversary of my father's Behind the Iron Curtain tour, to get to de-escalation and Ukraine and what's going on now. My brother Chris was in Russia much more recently, but his first trip was in 1988 with my father, as playing bass with his group. And that was because Mikhail Gorbachev liked Dave Brubeck. Rumor has it that Nancy Reagan somehow knew about this and told then President Reagan, all right, here's something we can literally bring to the table. And he had, and this was for the SALT talks, Strategic Arms Limitation, and SALT, that's the acronym. It sounds exaggerated, but I've heard it over and over again that the talks were not going well. There wasn't mutual trust. There was an agenda. Obviously, a summit doesn't happen unless it's very likely to be successful. But the delegates from each side just weren't hitting it off that well. And the Reagan gave a banquet, and the quartet played, and pretty soon people were kind of nodding along to the music, and the atmosphere completely changed. And the next day there was, I guess we could do strategic arms limitation, people started to like each other because they liked the jazz. So, of course, just playing some nice music isn't going to resolve the situation in Ukraine. But I think what happens in those situations is that there is a recognition of mutual humanity. And I think one of the reasons jazz is good at that, without disparaging other ways that this can happen, but the reason jazz is good at that is that while it started in America, other people can take up the music, add their own musical traditions and inflections to it, adapt it to their language, rebrand it, as it were, and it's still jazz. And there's very little, as much as we might appreciate other art forms, there are very few that sort of transcend, that work across race, across language, across generations now, the way jazz does. It's quite remarkable. And I'll close this monologue just to say that there is a movie in progress now called Playing the Changes, Tracking Darius Brubeck. It's being produced by an independent American and Dutch production company that is making exactly this point, that it's making a parallel. It starts in Poland with a lot of background material, interviews with people who were there in 1958, and then it shows a bit of my group on tour in Poland in 2018. And then it follows me around South Africa, talking and interviewing former students and colleagues and musicians. So on the one hand, you had the kind of formal political oppression that was communism, with its emphasis on conformity and controlling the arts, really controlling everything. And a very different form of oppression in South Africa, which was based on establishing and enforcing a racial hierarchy. So the oppressors had different methods and different goals, but the common denominator between the liberators, so to speak, were that the liberation movement in Poland strongly identified with jazz, and so did the liberation movement in South Africa in the early days. And again, we're talking about going back to the 80s. We're big jazz fans to a man. And Hugh Masekela was a major anti-apartheid activist. Abdul Ibrahim was a big spokesman for the movement, and so on. So jazz had that ability, and that, there was just that atmosphere around any sort of jazz gig. You didn't need to wear a button or wave a flag. People just knew that was what it was about.
And even in America, before the end of segregation, jazz was miles ahead, really, of anything else, with bands with the term that, integrated bands, right? Including the Dave Brubeck Quartet, but also Benny Goodman, Miles Davis playing with Bill Evans. It represents a very open mind, I think. And it will be interesting to see and I think important to see what happens with jazz in the coming weeks, months, years, in relation to whatever's going on in Russia right now, because I think it will be the canary in the coal mine of what's going on in that regime.
Yeah, yeah, it's so interesting. I'll be a little bit off message in terms of my own message. I want to believe that things could work somewhat in the same way, but that there is the problem of kind of co-optation, that when jazz was literally illegal, you kind of knew which side you were on and which side your audience was on, and so forth. I think nowadays, when I was playing in Moscow, Um, I don't know if the audience was necessarily made up of people who, would be 100% against invading Ukraine. Whereas in Poland in '58, my father could take that absolutely for granted.
Right.
So, there's been a dilution, through familiarity, and they're good Polish and Russian jazz musicians now and so forth. And, it doesn't quite have that kind of social effect, but I think it still does on an individual level, somehow. And thinking about here we are with a war going on, a really tragic war, and I hope that the artistic and humanistic traditions of Europe, to which Russia has contributed so much through literature and music, particularly, have some kind of mitigating effect. And I really want to, even though part of me wants to kind of pontificate about what I really think of the invasion and so forth. I think, a lot of, we can all take for granted that it's just simply wrong. But it's very hard to deliver words of wisdom under these circumstances. A few weeks ago, I could have just told you nice stories about Poland and how the Dave Brubeck tour was seen. I only found this out 60 years later. So actually, my parents never knew this, but that was a catalyst for their movement. Symbolically, if you go to the Solidarity Museum, which is there are experiential museums, right, where you walk through, you follow a timeline. The Civil Rights Museum in Memphis in America is marvelous in that way. The Solidarity Museum is like that too, where you start literally underground, because the movement is underground, and you emerge into the light. And there are the different stages that are kind of timelines. And the first vitrine in it is a circa 1958 shortwave radio, which the internet has made obsolete. But that was the piece of kit you needed in the East if you wanted to connect with the rest of the world, illegal to own. And a program, a concert program, Dave Brubeck Quartet, some words in Polish. And it was like, this didn't cause a cultural shift and a political shift, but it became a symbol of it. And it became a focal point of that kind of thing. I don't see how something like that could happen in Ukraine. And perhaps they don't need it because they don't want the Russians there. And we're not dealing with communism per se. It's
it's not completely analogous to then.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I was moved to tears though to see that, because obviously the American State Department and the CIA and everybody wanted the tour to be successful and to make a point, but no one had any idea how profound and lasting the effect had really been until after 1989.
Yeah. Looking forward, maybe just before we close off, looking forward, do you have any musical projects or performances that you're currently working towards?
A lot of my creative energy has been going into the book, frankly. But the next project on my computer desktop is to take a lot of my lead sheets which are very skeletal, as you would probably know. And I've started creating all of them into fully realized piano scores that I'll just make a book of my piano music that you can play when I finish doing it, because it will be completely notated. So that's in my future. Kathy and I are not the filmmakers, but obviously the film is very important to us, and we've collaborated extensively with that. And otherwise, we're still just kind of recovering from the disruption of COVID as far as touring and all that kind of thing. And Ronnie Scott's was kind of coming full circle in a way, or no, that's wrong. It's not a circle. It's a reset. That after playing that gig in 2020 with my brothers Chris and Dan, we continued on a tour. It was stopped as of lockdown. Dan and I got very ill. We were really, really terribly ill. The rest of the family members got off a little more lightly, and then everything stopped. But that's a bad note to close on. I'll just emphasize I'm rewriting all of my music as solo piano pieces. Royal Schools has a couple of them already.
Yes.
That's encouraged me to just do the rest.
Well, I'm glad you have recovered, at least from what I can tell, and I look forward to watching that film and playing the music and reading that book. Darius Brubeck, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It's been really great.
It was a pleasure, Zachary.